Our speakers today, I was really excited to bring them in as a panel to talk on this topic. While most of us last semester were sort of, keeping track of what was going on with the refugee crisis in Eastern Europe, they were actually experiencing it in part, and so they're here to talk to us a little bit about their trip, about their teaching, as well as working on some of the survey work with some of the first responders. Helping these people who are refugees from Syria and other places, trying to get into Europe. And so we have Terry Koenig, Richard Spano, and Sherry Warren. And both of the two folks on the left here are associate professors of social welfare, and then I assume, Sherry, that you're a doctoral student in social welfare.
Yes.
Welcome. Take it away.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we really welcome your participation here. We're going to just share, I've got 10 slides. We're going to talk a little bit about how we got involved in this process. It was pretty serendipitous. And then we're really going to open it up to discussion and questions, and really welcome that because you're a different kind of audience for us in particular to interact with, and we're excited about that because we're kind of over in the professions in social work, and we went over to do teaching, and when it turned out, or it looked like the teaching experience was not going to be, it was not going to come to fruition in the way that we had hoped to, we thought, oh my goodness, we better put something else in place, and we talked to our colleague, Jelena, you'll see her name up here, Ivelich. She came to KU's School of Social Welfare and was on a Fulbright here for a full year while she was working on her doctorate in our school. And so she's how we developed the initial connections and how we were going to set up to do the teaching. And then when we got concerned about if the teaching was going to materialize in the way that we'd hoped to, we decided to put a study together to talk with people that were working with the refugees. So we've been told that some folks don't like the term first responders because these were not 9/11, or what am I trying to say? They were not they were Red Cross volunteers, and they were journalists.
Not the same kind of crisis.
Yes, exactly.
An ongoing crisis.
Exactly. And so, and I can say much more about that. And maybe you all jump in terms of what happened, because I don't need to be the only one who's speaking about the experience. But it was powerful for us. It looked like it wasn't going to materialize. We were actually able to conduct 12 interviews with qualitative interviews and use a semi-structured interview guide. And what we have for you today is just some very preliminary data from the responders that's based on the interviews we did. And so we'd love to be able to share that with you. And one of the things that happened to us was that it didn't look like we were going to be able to interview anyone. And it was in our interactions with young journalists at the university where we were teaching, they said, we think we know some people who are on the front lines that you might be able to talk with. And so these young journalists in their late teens, early 20s, actually linked us up with the people that we ended up interviewing, most of them.
Most of them, yeah. We had a few backdoor connections through the State Department that came to fruition.
Yes.
And friends of friends of friends. As I put it, we would talk to anyone who we could get our hands on, or our questions on.
Okay. Do you want to add anything, Rick?
Simply that this is, we got the study okay right before we left.
5 days.
Yeah.
But there was a lack of structure to what it was that was going to happen. We were going to a place we'd never been, meeting with people we didn't know, and we had this dual function. There was some tension in that. As Terry mentioned, what they had originally invited us to come to do was to teach some classes. And the idea was that faculty, we would be teaching students and faculty would be attending, because their perspective on education is very much the way I would describe it is linear. You're the teacher, you give the students the information that they write it down, they give it back to you, and then they get a degree. And there's
It was not so interactive.
no, at all. I mean, there's one slide you'll see in here. They're at tables so that they really can't interact with each other. It's very difficult to do that. And they warned us. They said, when you do this, it's not going to work. The students won't interact with you because they're afraid of how they'll be perceived, not only by us, but by their fellow students. So there was a sense that they wouldn't do it. And so, which was an interesting experience. So we would do that in the day, and then we would get in the car and drive at night, and then sometimes we'd have one day where we weren't teaching and we'd go across the country. And fortunately we had a driver, someone who knew where she was going, because it was bizarre at times, to be honest with you. I mean, this is, if you need a nice tight structure, this is not the kind of experience you would want to have, that's for sure. It changed from moment to moment.
Yeah, that one day we set out to go to the lakes for a day of tourism, and we ended up visiting with social workers in 2 different locations and going to Vukovar, the site of a siege and massacre.
Mm-hmm.
And we thought we were going tourism day.
Exactly. So it's, if you're, and I mean, I'm okay with serendipity and spontaneity, but it was just, there were some days that were so long, we were exhausted. They were 10 to 12-hour days worth of teaching and interviewing. And we were there
pushed the limits of flexibility.
Yep, we were there for a little under 2 weeks, or a little over 2 weeks, excuse me. So let me talk to you. So Jelena is in the wheelchair. Jelena is very much our Croatian colleague, and her driver, Ivana, is behind her. And this is a scene at Rovine. This is one of the places where we had a chance just to visit and interact with people. But really a powerful statement in terms of the lack of flexibility with, or ability to handle someone who's got a disability. I mean, she's had pretty major challenges herself in terms of trying to function in Croatia. She grew up on the island of Brač, which we had a chance to visit. And she was actually pulled from that island really quickly because her parents couldn't provide the care and the support that she needed. And so she ended up growing up on the mainland in order to get the kind of support she needed to deal with her disability. Anything else you'd like to say about that or add?
Well, I'm more of a Latin Americanist, not a CREES person. So I had very little idea of what we were getting ourselves involved in other than what our colleague, who I grew to know while she was here on her Fulbright, had talked to us about, and then the preliminary weeks of preparing to go. So I was constantly amazed at how many different places had owned or considered part of their empire Croatia throughout history. So I was not prepared for the Italian or Venetian influence that was there.
And she actually set us up to visit the castle of Klis, and you all may know that or recognize that from the Game of Thrones, which is the site of many of the episodes, is my understanding. And that was a special tour. It's not really open per se to the public, and that was the castle that was at the border of the Turks, who were coming and invading. And in Split, outside of Split, and it's also the castle that helped to stop the Venetians from invading. So you all, again, may be able to teach us a fair amount about that history.
It was difficult, though, to experience her frustrations firsthand trying to get around in these 2,000-year-old sites.
Absolutely. So this reflects the teaching experience. We taught at the University of North in 2 different sites. So somebody help me with, I know how to pronounce Varaždin, and is it Koprivnica? Do I have that correct?
Koprivnica.
Say it again?
Koprivnica.
Koprivnica. And so we were at both sites, and we were able to not only demonstrate interactive teaching among the students, but we were also, the faculty wanted to meet with us in a separate session and wanted to talk with us about different kinds of teaching styles and doing group work with students, and so that was really kind of cool for us, and it's part of what we bring to the table and how we teach. So it was nice to have kind of an exchange of ideas around teaching.
The only other thing I'd add is we were teaching oftentimes not in our discipline. We were teaching journalists. And it was the cadre of journalists that we were interacting with who then became the leads to be able to talk to people who were, some of them were part of the volunteers that were responding, but they also then knew others. Like they would describe, well, there's an NGO that they could connect us with. And then when you pushed it a little bit on it, it was 4 young people who had formed an NGO and were distributing resources to the refugees as they came through.
And they were from Switzerland, no less.
Right.
So they'd come over and,
So
yeah.
they had their own little tents they lived in, or a communal house situation, and they would work 12, 14 hours a day, sometimes 20 hours a day, and then they'd return. But they had created NGOs so that they could get some resources that would allow them to distribute that, what people needed.
All of us had a chance to interview different folks for the qualitative portion of the study, and so we each had kind of a different experience with some of the journalists and the NGO folks and Red Cross. So this just describes our NGO, or our project, and the NGO volunteers, the journalists. We attempted to interview social workers. They were in our discipline. We thought we were going to be able to interview with them because they are actually the ones who were pulling the unaccompanied minors out of the group of migrants that were passing through. And at this point, there were 2,000 people in a train twice a day passing through the Croatian border. And so they would come through as a huge group, and the social workers were picking off if they saw unaccompanied minors. They were taking those unaccompanied minors and trying to find a kind of guardian for them, or they were functioning in that fashion themselves, which I thought was really was powerful. We really wanted to interview them, and we were clear on the Serbian border when we attempted to do that. We were in the last town,
Thing called Cheesy.
right, close to Vukovar, and they refused us. So they absolutely refused to interview and interact with us. I called the migration a site Syrian migration. They were offended by that and said it was not a Syrian migration. It was, did I not know that there were a lot more, that it was bigger than that, which then kind of stunned me, and we ended up, all of us, and we ended up doing our homework through and looking at UN statistics to find out that about 55% of the people passing through, the refugees, were indeed Syrian, but there were 2 other huge groups of both Afghan and Iraqi refugees that were passing through, as well as Eritrea refugees. Those were the largest groups. So we, it was a good experience on some levels. It was disappointing that happened.
It was enlightening, though, to have that experience of trying to interview people who knew we were coming and what we wanted, and who then refused when we got there.
Yeah, we actually scheduled the interviews with them, unlike in some of the other settings where they happened almost serendipitously, and we were able to interview people on the spot.
Why do you think they refused to talk to you? What's your...
They said...
About you, about them, about the conflict?
They said it was, that they would need permission from the Ministry of Social Services, basically, to speak with us, and that there was a concern of confidentiality since many of them had become sort of what we would call, I guess, guardian ad litem for many of these minors.
And some of it was, I would say, verged on very overt hostility toward the United States. Their perception of the situation, and when you add in Afghanistan and Iraq, is that the United States has created this, and now they're dealing with it. And I think that was standing right behind, that was the formal response. But there was, it wasn't just a response, there was a lot of energy that came across the table at us. I felt at that meeting that they were not going to have anything to do with us.
You know that, sorry, looks flow. You know that there's some other non-American other researchers or journalists have better luck with them? I'm just trying to see whether this is...
They said that there was a German researcher who had a much better understanding of the migration experience, and they were much more comfortable with him and in terms of what he was doing, the work he was doing, which I thought was really, yeah, so.
And all of this went through a translator, so
Yeah, you
we
also have to
could
deal with
really
that.
tell that not everything was actually being translated to us.
They sort of pulled us off to the side and said, these folks aren't going to talk to you.
And you didn't offer any recompense on this one?
So-
Any recompense for interview? You didn't offer any reward?
We had nothing. We had nothing to give.
Right, and I would say in my discipline in social work, it's kind of a 50-50 split on whether, because it's a funky, if
No,
you
I'm not-
offer
I'm not
payment, and I'm not
insisting,
saying
just
you,
curious to clarify.
no, I think it's a really important element of a study, because if you offer payment, then you also, I don't know, there's a belief that sometimes that can backfire in the sense that you're getting people who want the money, whatever it is, and then, but there's the other side of it, which is what you're kind of alluding to, which is maybe we would have gotten more of more of a response if we had offered some kind of payment. That never actually ever came up, at least not in the interviews I did.
It seemed like this instance really punctuated this underlying current of suspicion of
Yes.
researchers from the U.S.,
Right.
which is why much of the planning and our arrival and how flexible we had to be as we went along with things really was initiated, because people who said they originally were willing to speak with us, have us come teach in their classes, have us come to conferences, backed out in perhaps with suspicion about what our motives were.
And other things arose. So when we thought we weren't going to have enough to do, we ended up with too much to do. It was overwhelming. I was literally exhausted. I ended up with a stomach condition and took myself off of coffee completely when I got back. It was just like, oh my goodness, I'm a pretty healthy soul, and I think that it was a pretty stressful. I would describe it as one of the most stressful overseas trips I've taken because of the lack of about the scheduling and stuff.
And I think part of it too, that we didn't interview for the study, but the students we were interacting with would come, and I had several, maybe 3 or 4, who came to me and said, what is it the United States is really trying to do in this part of the world? There's a very clear sense that underneath all this is oil. And if the United States can destabilize these countries, then they'll have access to the oil, and that's what it's about. And there's I think it's probably a fairly broadly held perspective that that's what we're really about in terms of the United States policy. So there's a real suspicion there. And who can, if I lived in Afghanistan or Iraq, I would have very strong feelings about it too.
Absolutely. Probably our most interesting discussions when we speak of the teaching element had to do with the journalist, for me, was with the group of journalists. And when I say a group, I'm talking 100 students in the room. It was absolutely huge. And we got into a discussion about discrimination and about stratification. We were teaching a piece on empowerment, which is in social work, that's a huge part of what we talk about. And we were talking about who are the most powerful people in your country, and how does that layer in? And it was incredible. In terms of, the people that are rich, that have politically are at the top, and then I'm trying to remember.
The politicians were
Right underneath. The politicians were right underneath. And then at the bottom were the Roma people, and they spent probably 15 to 20 minutes talking about how they realized that they had contributed to the problems that they were seeing with the Roma people, that they had not treated them well, and there was this relationship they had with them. So things I hadn't planned on or didn't know that it would emerged.
So interwoven through all these days of teaching, half days of teaching, when there was a spare moment for a full week, we were interviewing people. Or there would be times where Rick and Terry were teaching a class and I was in a different space interviewing people who were students at this university or who were working at the nearby train station to help the refugees. Again, anyone who was willing to talk to us, to people who just happened to be Croatian citizens who were passionate about the topic and had something to say on it.
Absolutely.
Had experienced being a refugee themselves in the 90s or who remembered as children having family and friends come live with them during the Croatian War of Independence, which we learned is how you talk about it there.
And so, as Sherry mentioned, one of the people that we're going to talk briefly about or refer to her in terms of quotes, it was a Red Cross staff member, but also a former refugee from the 1990s war and period of war, and then was also a PhD researcher on top of that. So we had a journalism student and two other journalists, but one of the journalists was also a philosophy professor. So these were the questions we were interested in exploring, and we had, and Jelena was really instrumental in helping us shape those questions. So we were looking at what are the experiences of volunteers or responders to, and their perceptions of the refugees. What are their views of informal and formal supports and their adequacy? How is Croatia doing in terms of meeting the needs of the refugees? What risks did the participants face and what supports did they have? And were there any informal support networks that existed among the refugees themselves? So those were the kinds of questions we were interested in exploring. And I'm going to move through because we've only got, we wanted to, within 5 to 10 minutes, we want to make sure we open it up. Does someone want to share this first slide and share the quotes off of this slide? This is a building in
I'll explain the
Vukovar.
picture. So
Yeah.
in Vukovar, this day that we went to Vukovar, if you don't know, Vukovar is a city over near the Serbian border. It's right on the river that is the border between Croatia and Serbia. And about 2,000 Croats were under siege for 87 days from 30,000 members of the Yugoslav and some impromptu militia put together. And there was a hospital massacre there in violation of the United Nations and Red Cross agreements. So it's a pretty well-known city. And through the whole city, there are pockmarked buildings. The water tower stands as a testament that the urban planners actually chose to keep to remind people who passed through there what happened in the 90s. And so this was a building really close to the city center that had come sort of a makeshift monument garden to what had happened.
So you can see the quotations there, and like the second quote is just like couldn't have been more than 19 years old, and it's almost a quote like it just, to me, powerful. I think we should feed the hungry, warm those who are cold, and give them shelter no matter that they are sick old people. We shouldn't consider the age or race or anything.
It did seem to come up several times that there were young men in the migration, and I know that the Western media picked up on this and talked about the prejudice and bias against those young men that were also leaving these areas where other people said they should be staying and fighting. Yet the point was there's nothing to fight for in many of these cases. They're leaving with their families.
Absolutely. Whereas in my understanding, as I talk with folks who work with this issue of migration, is that most of the people who migrate, shame on me, are people who are women and children. So men typically are not doing the migrating, which I thought was also kind of interesting. And what was I going to say about that? The other element of this notion of men is that when you read some of the quotes, the police officers or when they separated the people out, when they began to migrate into Eastern Europe, the police officers actually separated the men from the women and children, and put the women and children's, because I've got a bad wrist, I have a broken wrist. So, and put the women and children ahead in the trains, and then separated them from their partners, from their husbands and fathers. And they did that in an attempt to try to, I don't think it was mean-spirited at all. It was an attempt to try to get the women and children out first, but in doing so, they separated up a bunch of families. And so that created an interesting problem. The last quote is from the woman who was also a refugee in the 1990s, and I think it's also a powerful quote because she's talking about how it's one thing to be passing through and another thing to be a refugee for a couple of years. And that people in the country get bored with you, they are less likely to help you. Initially they view you as a stranger, but then once you've been there for a while, they have a different take on you. And she further described some experiences of, she described her bitterness about some of the experiences she had where she felt really discriminated against. And she was what they would refer to as an internally displaced Croatian refugee. Rick, do you have?
No, I'm good.
Sorry. This is Pula. This is our guide. We had just a powerful experience in Pula. That's where we got much clearer, I think, about the influences of so many different cultures on Croatia. But this is about the risks and supports.
This first quote was from a journalism student who actually had been a professional journalist and then decided to go to school to become a journalist. So he was in our classes as well as participating in the conversations with us. But he was talking about having gone to the train station community and with the goal of recording the stories and reporting on what he had seen, but he was so moved by what he saw, he couldn't help but jump in and do everything he could. He accidentally crossed over several times into Hungary because this is where the refugees were passing across the Hungarian border under cover of night, with people in the woods with flashlights guiding them, so they had no idea where it was they were going or who was guiding them, just walking and walking. So he passed over a couple of times without realizing he had crossed over because he was talking with people and he was helping people. Is the thing where they carry people on here?
It's in the next slide, yeah.
Okay.
No.
He was incredibly moved by his experience, and he continued to go back, not with the goal of necessarily reporting on the story, but because he said he couldn't not go and do anything he could. So he and a couple of his colleagues were gathering any supplies they could get their hands on, which, from what I read and a few people told us, these makeshift NGOs and folks who were just coming and helping out of the goodness of their hearts and their own resources were helpful to the Red Cross because they could do things that the Red Cross volunteers and employees could not do.
Yeah, there was a sense of that they were working together, although once in a while there was some tension about that. For example, the Red Cross ran out of smaller bottles of water, and all they had were 5-gallon containers. So you have families going along, and you got kids, you're lugging your kids, and sometimes it was a take a blanket or take water or do whatever, that refugees were making choices that were in the moment. If they were cold, they took the blanket, and they were going to need the water later. And so there was some tension about that, but for the most part, I think they saw themselves in it together. One other one that it's not in here, an interview which I did. I had a sense from the people I talked with, this was a life-changing experience for them. There was a young woman, probably 21 maybe, who was a fairly famous entertainer, singer in this area, and she could fill a theater and people would come, and so that's what she was doing for a living. And when she got there and saw what was happening, Even in her description of it, she described, particularly with the children and the women, and it's cold and it's rainy when we were there. So it's not a pleasant climate. She broke down and just wept during the interview, so we just sat there for a while and sort of went off script and off, just for her to be able to get some of that out. So what she did was she stopped performing except for one day a week. She comes back and she performs, and then she takes all the money that she earns in that one night and she takes it back, and for the next 5 days she works for it.
Who is it? A singer from the area?
Yes,
Or?
yes.
Okay.
It's pretty
Yeah, I'd
amazing,
have to-
isn't it?
Yeah.
Interesting. We'll only have a few more slides. And Sherry's actually kind of hinted at, do you want to share that, because that's someone you interviewed?
This was the journalist/journalism student again talking about what he witnessed, and there was a young woman who was he described as a paraplegic, who perhaps being carried by family or people she knew, have no idea. She was in the middle of a blanket, and 4 people would take the corners of the blanket and carry her as far as they could until they were too exhausted and set her down, and she sat until some other 4 people would come along. So he helped carry her for as long as he could until his arms gave out, and he felt that for his own personal safety and legal reasons he needed to turn back. But he also broke down in the conversation that we were having, and I ended up referring him to a therapist that I knew in Croatia because of the lasting effects he had gotten to where he couldn't sleep. Every time he went home, he did nothing but sob because he was so overwhelmed by the feelings of what he saw and the plight of the people that he had tried to help.
And what you also see is their sense of, in the last quote, their sense of that the support was not adequate for them. You know, it's one thing to support the refugees and to help them, but there's almost a parallel process in terms of what do we need to do to help those responders who are trying to provide that support. And his view was that all of these governments need to be coming together. It needs to be an overall European response to the refugees. And that was, at that point, he didn't feel it was adequate at all.
Oh, and the Croatian elections were coming up in just a few weeks, so there was this underlying current of politically what was supposed to be happening in Croatia and who they were trying to garner favor with among the EU.
Absolutely. So, and you just...
Oh, sorry.
That's great. No, it's a great segue. So it's a great segue, and you may know more about this. I wanted to make sure this has really been powerful for me because although I've taught social policy, I'm certainly not by any means really tuned in to Eastern European social policy, and this has really stretched me as a person. And so the refugee crisis did impact the Croatian national election. The Conservatives did win, but they did not get enough votes to rule alone, is my understanding as I did my own reading. You all may know more about this and can respond to it. And Croatia and Slovenia in early March closed their borders, and they did so after Austria made a decision to cap the refugees coming through. And then finally, just on the 29th of March, just a few days ago, this EU-Turkey agreement has come into place, but there are huge problems with it in a sense that it probably will not hold or work. And so this is our last slide. We wanted to deepen our understanding of volunteers' experiences and support. I'm also, I just did a Skype interview with a colleague who's in Germany, in the center of the country, and he is saying, he's saying that there are huge numbers of social workers really involved in resettling the refugees that are coming into Germany, and that they're dispersing them throughout the country on both the east and western side of Germany, and in very rural as well as urban areas where there are much less resources and support than in other places. And that, to me, is fascinating. What we heard was that their identity is changing as they continue to do this work with the refugees. And Rick, you have alluded to and talked about the role of the state in helping to shape the response to the refugees and your interests in history?
Well, it just, the whole process by which Germany made the decision to open its borders and what all that was about and what it seems to me is quite complex, certainly beyond anything we can do here, but what they appear to be doing is to disperse people throughout the country so that there's not large settlements of people in any one place. They're dispersed throughout the country, which I don't know what that will, I have no idea how that will work in Germany as a response, but the reality of it is I'm sure they're trying to avoid the potential for radicalism that can come from a community where people are concentrated together and then they experience being the other in that country. But they're being thoughtful about what they're doing, but it's a lot of people to absorb. It will change forever the culture in that country.
There
I'm
are
done.
towns like Passau on the Austrian-German border with maybe 7,000 inhabitants, and they're getting thousands more than that coming through there every week. And they, whatever the goodwill is, they are so overwhelmed that they really, and the government keeps making billions of euros available, the federal government, but a lot of the important initiatives are coming from individuals, from charitable organizations, and at the local level. Because some of these towns are getting just an hour forewarning that they're going to have 5,000 refugees arriving at the train station or the bus station. How do you deal with that on a practical level? It's complicated.
Thank you for jumping in and being so involved. You know, I really appreciate the interaction. Are there other comments, questions, things that you think we should be paying attention to, insights you have about your experience with this refugee, this great migration or crisis?
I have a question. What is the purpose of choosing to interview volunteers and NGO instead of victims themselves?
I was just about to say something about that, Amina. Thanks for asking. I think there are several reasons behind that, and we probably each have our own personal reasons. Towards the end of our stay, we had the opportunity to go to the train station, and it wasn't clear that we were going to be able to interview people, and our IRB didn't specify, our request did not include interviewing refugees themselves. One, because we weren't sure language-wise what we were going to be walking into. We also weren't sure that we were going to be able to do anything with the, and I mean do anything, like personally be able to do anything about the situations we would hear about. And it felt a little voyeuristic to speak with people and not do anything. A little bit like, I personally was not comfortable with the opportunity. And I knew that for my own heart and soul of preservation, I couldn't go and just watch and not do something. And I wasn't in a position to do something. So I chose, we didn't have enough room in the car when we were talking about going, so I was going to remain behind. And as it turned out, the opportunity kind of dissolved anyway. But we weren't sure to begin with. The opportunity in general presented itself about 2.5 weeks before we left. So we were scrambling to get our human subjects, our study and thoughts put together and then get it through human subjects in general. That was part of it.
And part of it, once we got there, from a very practical standpoint, where we were in Croatia, the people came off the trains, and they had maybe, as I understood the description of it, a couple hundred yards of territory that they walked across, where the NGOs and the Red Cross and people were set up, and then they went off the road and into the woods. And I mean, they literally were walking, so you would have to walk with them if you were going to do that. But the time that they were actually in Croatia was only a couple of hours total. it was the time to walk to the border, and then once they crossed over into Hungary, then they got on the next train that was going to go. And the way it was described is these are, Terry mentioned something earlier that I think is important, that maybe speaks to the desperation that these folks have, in the sense that they followed people into these dark woods with nothing but flashlights, hoping that there's a train at the other end, but not knowing. They
were
had no
scared.
knowledge. They didn't know what countries they were in.
Yeah.
They didn't know where they were. They didn't know where they were going. And so the vulnerability of this group, as Sherry said, I mean, I was very uncomfortable with the notion that somehow when somebody's scrambling to try to save their children, that they should stop and talk to me. I mean, that just seems a little out of line.
One of the other things I would say, this is such a great comment or question, I think. And one of the other things that we heard was that the researchers are descending on the refugees, okay? And it was like, well, how can we, so the other thing that's really grabbed me is, what about all the people that are working with them? What about the systems, informal and formal, that are going to be set up or that are being set up to help them? What does that look like? And there's very little attention being paid to that. And it just felt like a better fit. And then I just was stunned. I didn't realize, because in Croatia, I'm not sure there are that many social workers working directly with the refugees, whereas in some of these countries, because my profession is social work, that really grabs my interest. What is it that these social workers are doing with the refugees? How is that working? So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but does that get?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and also what kind of training that these social workers or volunteer gets, because I know like culturally is different cultures, people like what things that in the West might be fine, like for example eye contact and stuff like that, in some of those society is not part of. So how do they train them to do their work, but at the same time not offend the newcomers who are not familiar with the European culture?
After spending a little time in Kazakhstan, there are plenty of people who are ethnic Russian in Kazakhstan, but they know me immediately because of my nonverbals, because I'm much more gregarious in terms of even how I carry myself. I mean, I'm just like they can see me a mile away. And so I think that's really troubling to me, because who am I?
Yeah, she's from Kazakhstan, so ask her if you can see.
Oh. So my daughter-in-law is Kazakh. So my son is married to a woman from Kazakhstan, and my interest in the region, I did a Fulbright in Kazakhstan and did some teaching and research in that area, and and it really struggled to become, and have continued to struggle to become much more ethnically and culturally aware with my daughter-in-law and now grandbabies. So, it's just that whole, so I'm a big white person coming into a culture that's very different than my own. In some ways I kind of feel like to be, and I do, that's why I talked about Jelena being our partner, but really, wouldn't it make much more sense if people that were in Croatia were the ones doing the interviewing, and somehow we should partner with them, maybe we can support them in collecting data, but what does it mean to do participatory, because that's what we're talking about, is participatory action research, which is much more involving people in their own country doing, even asking the questions. What kinds of questions do they think are important to get answered? Does that begin to, yeah.
Thank you.
Let me just follow up on your comment. I look at this list, and I think it's very promising and I think thought-provoking. I wonder specifically, would I have any experience or any interest in future research to look specifically at how receiving society others refugees in terms of religion. So there's the religious dimension, of course, and that's the stereotypes and prejudice that is probably quite pervasive, especially given the history of Europe in general, but that part of the world, and the uneasy relationship between Christians and Muslims, and how it intersects with race, because they are also distinct racially. So it's a part of a the big picture that you want to explore? I'm a sociologist. I'm thinking about this from that perspective.
That's
I
a,
think those themes came up several times in the interviews of in a couple of different ways of the participants saying it doesn't matter what they believe or where they're from, they're human, and how can I not do something to help? But then at the same time, in the same interview, saying things like, well, they're just passing through our country. I'm sure that we would feel different if they were going to be settling here.
Yeah, I
So-
think it's an important dimension here. And I think you're mentioning about, because in my interview here, one thing is like we all like to, ready to do some little favors. But when it comes to long-term commitment, it's very different.
Absolutely,
You
absolutely.
know, if someone we like to open a door for someone, and they say nice things, but we're not going to do it on a continuously on a daily basis. It's a different thing, and I think that's also part of this fatigue or routinization of that experience that brings back or highlights the issues of race and religion more so than perhaps in this initial contact.
I've got several colleagues in Germany who are all part of a particular faith community who are doing some of this work. And while they have offered to stay in touch with me about this, I may have to turn that over to other friends and colleagues because I've kind of got some other things on my plate right now as far as my doctoral work. But their understanding of being in the faith community and watching how this changes their town, or towns that don't particularly have a mosque or whatever house of worship is being sold out, how will this restructure that community? And as Terry said, I think it's going to maybe subtly and sometimes probably somewhat dramatically change the culture of Germany and other nations that are receiving lots of these migrants that are needing to be resettled. I think there's a wealth of information that we could start exploring.
And we did hear a lot of conversation about, from, not necessarily from participants here, but just the general conversations that we were having, concern about the fact that I think the unemployment rate was close to 20% in Croatia. And they said, what are these people going to do? And the implied part is, we don't have enough jobs for Croatians. Are they going to come in and take our job? I mean, you could have been in Dallas and read the paper. And I mean, I think it's an international phenomenon, the fear that people have that they're, especially if they're on the edges of the economic structure, that they'll be displaced further. And it's a very real fear. I mean, those are hard questions.
It's a very good point, because underlying fears are fundamentally economics, but they often expressed in sort of terms of religious otherness or stereotype or racial, like it is happening in the United States and all over the place. Those are easy markers to pick on and say, so they don't require a lot of deep sort of economic analysis on the part of the general public. You just see they're different and they are a threat because they're different.
I have to admit that in the 90s, when we were meddling over there finally and getting involved, and I couldn't tell who was whom. I didn't know whose side we were supposed to be on. It was very confusing to me. Having gone there now, I understand the confusion. I'm not less confused, but I understand why I'm so confused. And when you think about it historically, the invasion of Croatia came from the Turks up on along the coast, where that castle and Split is.
Yeah.
It's set up in such a way that all of the roads that come from the south come to one point, and you can see it from the east end of the castle. The west end of the castle overlooks the Adriatic, so they could see the Venetians when they came at them. But this is like a constant. It's not a problem. It's almost like a condition that these things happen, that people invade, and this group is coming from what is a long history of people who come from the Middle East into Croatia. So it's not the first time, and there are remnants. We could hear the reactions of the people from the 1990s war that were playing out in their reactions here.
They described themselves as they thought they would be more compassionate, and they were really proud of how they'd responded to the refugees, because many of them had been refugees themselves in the 1990s and they remembered that. And they thought that really their response was different because of their experience, because of that set of
And I
experiences.
think it is in general Europe and part of the United States. If you think about acceptance of people of other race or other cultures, not that Germany, for instance, and much of Europe has much experience with Islam and Muslims, that much more than say here in the United States.
Mhm.
So it's not an overt and immediate rejection, or it's much more
Yeah.
subtle.
Yeah.
It's like here, the problem of race. No one is racist anymore, like explicitly. But race is much more subtle. Race is much more subtle. And that's probably even more problematic. What really poses a challenge. So it's not like everyone thinks, I hate Muslims, so I hate this and that. It's a much more subtle opposition and prejudice. And I think that's, you as social workers, it's very important to get into that very sort of subtle nuances that very consequential.
When I heard that you couldn't be a Croat, if you were a Croat, you were automatically Catholic. I didn't realize that there was, but yet there are Bosnians and Serbians that
Right.
live in Croatia. So
Yes.
it's not like it's completely.
The national identity and distinction of what nation you claimed meant a lot about your entire ethnic history as well as your religion
Religious.
was so fascinating.
And there was a quote by one of the people we interviewed: "Whenever there are two Croats, there are three opinions." I thought it was like to me a classic kind of comment about the region and all the different people that have passed through and the experiences that they've had to face in those journeys. So, we actually were able to make it down to Dubrovnik. So, I didn't really even understand this. So, it wasn't top on my list necessarily. They were insistent on taking us down, and there was there's a piece of land that's Bosnian
Yeah.
that you've been obviously, so
Yeah.
that you have to cross through because they wanted that outlet to the sea.
And that's the only place in Bosnia that connects the Adriatic, and you
Right.
have to go through Croatia to get there, and then you have to go through Bosnia to get on Croatia.
That to me is just really eye-opening. I mean, it reflects the mentality or the way the culture has grown up and developed. Are you
Yeah, I'm Serbian, so.
okay? So or does that mean you're Orthodox?
Yeah, it does actually.
I didn't want to assume that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I was like, what
They did
is that?
Yeah, it is, you can easily, yeah. It sounds really overgeneralized and maybe oversimplistic, but Croatian people typically are Catholic, Bosnians are typically Muslim, Serbs are typically Orthodox.
We were privy to this hilarious and interesting conversation between Jelena and our driver about how do you tell a Serb from a Bosnian
Can
from
you
a
tell?
Croat? And Jelena swore she could.
Yeah,
And
I don't want to say yeah.
Even that said, you strip them naked and you can tell, and Jelena was like, don't talk to me about people being naked. Like, totally deflected the conversation, and then she finally admitted, well, it has to do with how they dress and their behaviors.
I think in that context, it's also because the language is essentially the same, so
Yeah.
religion is the real marker of difference.
Mhm.
You typically, outside of the United States, most countries outside the United States, the language is an important marker of your distinctive identity, and that's not the case. So religion is particularly important as an identifier.
It's interesting because I think you make a really good point about the religious differences, and I think it's a struggle for me as an American to figure out where do I sit in relationship to this notion of what does it mean to be a Muslim? How does that, I don't want to act like it's not there. What's the best way to talk about religion in relationship to different ethnicities and races. And so, in some ways, I think social work is very nationalistic, so you don't see, social work has been slow to do international work. And so I think as a profession, we've struggled in some ways to take on some of these issues in that way. And I wrestle with this notion of religion and that diversity and how to be respectful.
Well, I think in that context also interesting to look how the local or native Muslims treat as Muslim newcomers. So they really identify with them, or they say no, we're not, like they're different. It's like, you know, history in this country. You had immigration, early immigration of Jews, and then Jews coming from Eastern and Eastern and Southern Europe were kind of rejected and shot by the older Jews because they don't want to be associated with those uneducated and uncivilized and so on newcomers. So it would be interesting to see how the European Muslims, both of native, like say Bosnians or immigrant roots, treat these refugees. I think it's
That's
I
a
suspect
great
it would be
question,
very
actually.
ambivalent. It's not going to be very complex.
My
On one
understand-
hand, solidarity. On the other hand, really we're different, we're distant, and so on. So it's going to be interesting.
So is it, my understanding is that a lot of the Muslims in Germany, for example, are
Right,
Turkish.
in
Are
Germany.
Turkish,
Yeah.
right? And is that, but that was.
I'm talking about, of course, there are other things like for North Africa now and other parts of Europe. Germany, of course, is predominantly
But that's
Turkish origin.
Those are very different kinds of Muslim faiths, right? I mean, it's not all.
Yeah, of course.
It's
but
not
that-
all the same Islam.
Right.
Yes, well, yeah, that's part of the story. It's like, you know, not all Jews are the same. You know, Yiddish speaking, Hebrew speaking, Ashkenazi, but from the host society perspective, most of us, or most of the sort of mainstream society doesn't really care about those details. They're all Muslims, for us. And so that's within Muslims or within minorities, they
There's a
try
big deal.
to establish those hierarchies for a number of reasons. It has to do with fundamental issues of access to jobs or economic opportunities too. But it's expressed in terms of religious identity or in terms of racial identity, so it's explicitly or somewhat implicitly, and that's very consequential.
And something that's interesting about Bosnians and Muslims and Bosnians, that they're called or often referred to as Balkan Muslims, because they smoke, they drink, they're more ethnically Slavic, but Muslim or Islam is their religion. So there's already a kind of a division between.
Even like what they identified as, do they identify as Muslims or as Bosnian, or as, because I know like in case of France, like when you go there, there are like assimilation is very big in France. You have to be assimilated to be French. You have to identify yourself as a French. So like Muslims themselves, like how they feel, the North African Muslims, the West African Muslims, even within them there's different identity, and who's more Islamic with the physical appearance, looking like Arab or looking like African. So like that is like really interesting.
Folks, I'm afraid we're almost out of town.
Out of town too.
Going on there, but I'm going to take a moment to thank our speakers and thank you for taking part in the conversation.